Hello everyone, sorry I couldn't be here yesterday. I understand I missed an awesome day. So I look forward to catching up with many of you during breaks and lunch to try and catch up. I want to just acknowledge that a lot of the work I've been doing while at NOAA has been supported by my team who works on blue carbon, and my co-lead on the blue carbon work is Amber Moore at NOAA. So I got into looking at where does coastal blue carbon potentially fit into policy when about 4+ years ago, NOAA leadership turned around and said, okay, so we've got partners approaching us, thank you, Ray and CI, for saying, hey, we're working on blue carbon, NOAA, what are you doing? And NOAA leadership turned around and said, what do we know about the state of the policy? What do we know about the state of the science? Should we be working on this issue? And so the first question was, well, when it comes to policy, are we incorporating carbon services of coastal wetlands, or all wetlands, into our environmental policies? And if we're not, could we be? So we started to take a look at that. And so along with a team of us, we examined where does coastal blue carbon fit, or could fit, into the implementation of several policies, including the Clean Water Act, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment Process, Coastal Zone Management Act, and the National Environmental Policy Act. And we determined that carbon services are not currently included in the implementation of any of those policies, and yet they could be in the way they are written. They tend to have a very broad framing that even if they didn't use the word ecosystem services, really encompassed the broad functioning and health of ecosystems. And so really we probably should be including carbon services. And one of the really interesting parts of this analysis, which actually it came out in 2 different publications, I'm happy to share those with anyone who wants to send me an email. My email's at the end of the presentation. The really interesting finding from this is that if we incorporated carbon services into the implementation of these environmental policies, it could actually lead to more habitat conservation, either protection or restoration, and climate mitigation. And the reason for that is that the focus of the way we implement our policies currently tends to be on living resources. So for example, if we have a Clean Water Act project where we're going to impact a wetland, we tend to think about, well, how many birds' nests are going to be impacted? How many acres of sedge are we going to impact? You know, that kind of question. And then we figure out how to mitigate those living resources. This seemed like a good way of trying to mitigate the lost ecosystem services until you realize that the carbon stored in these coastal wetlands, and I know you guys have heard all about this, but these are many meter deep soils typically. This is old carbon that's been stored for decades, if not hundreds or thousands of years. So when we lose the carbon from these systems, we're losing way more than probably is being accounted for if we have typical mitigation ratios, which tend to be something like 3-to-1, 5-to-1, because we know when we restore a system, we don't get back all those services right away. But if we were to account for the soil resources in these settings, we probably would need mitigation ratios more like 20-to-1, maybe even 50-to-1, right? Because we're losing that old stored legacy carbon. So there really are opportunities here if we did start to incorporate carbon services. This is a particular ecosystem service that if we were to incorporate it might really shift the way we implement those policies. So what's the next step in terms of where we go with this? Well, a few of us at NOAA have been trying to actually set a precedent and make it possible to lay the groundwork for incorporating carbon into some of these policies. And so what we've been able to accomplish so far is the Sears Point NEPA environmental assessment. Sears Point was a restoration project that's currently happening in the San Francisco Bay Area. And in that environmental assessment, we actually included discussion of the climate mitigation benefits of doing the restoration. So this is a nice soft way to enter this discussion because we're talking about all the positives of doing restoration instead of talking about the negatives of impacts that other projects might have. But as a result, this started a whole conversation in the Restoration Center at NOAA where folks there said, wow, if this is the case at Sears Point, it's probably the case at a lot of the sites we're restoring. And so, as a result, we've actually included language now in the Programmatic Environmental Impact Statement, or PEIS, which I think is done with public review now, but went through public review recently. And this is going to be the guidance, basically, that will help to inform all restoration projects that NOAA is doing. And so basically what we've got included in there, if it can make it through that public review and into the final product, is the opportunity to say, hey, we should be considering carbon. That doesn't mean carbon's going to be a big part of every restoration we do, but it should be at least one of the factors we consider when we're doing a restoration project, and it should maybe be one of the criteria that we're using when we're thinking about making decisions about what kind of restoration, how much acreage, and those kinds of goals. So this is exciting. It's a step forward, but really implementing, incorporating carbon into these types of policies is really going to take a lot of effort. It's going to take interagency effort. So it's not a short-term, quick fix kind of idea here. So the hypothetical is really easy to do, but the actual change in implementation is much more complicated because many of these laws are implemented by multiple agencies. So it's not as easy as it might sound. But I think we're making slow progress on demonstrating the benefit of doing this. Okay, so what about other federal policies, and particularly emerging opportunities? So last fall, it was very exciting when the White House released the priority agenda for enhancing the climate resilience of America's natural resources. So this document, and I'm not expecting you to be able to read this, has four main activities, main goals. And the second one is manage and enhance U.S. carbon sinks. Now, the fact that that actually even ended up being one of the goals of this document is actually due to the fact that there were a lot of conversations with several agencies saying, hey, a big part of the way we should be thinking about climate resilience is to be managing and protecting our natural carbon sinks. So where I get really excited, not only that this made it into the document, but that we actually managed to have it not just be about forests, because the initial conversations that were happening in the federal government were about how we manage our forests to be better natural sinks. And forests are clearly an important part of our natural sinks. But we managed to expand that conversation and demonstrate that grasslands, wetlands, and coastal areas are also important parts of that conversation. This was a huge win, because prior to this, the discussion about wetlands and coastal ecosystems being part of that natural sink was not even happening at all. And so this is super exciting. It made it into the document, and not only did it make it into the document, we actually have two specific blue carbon activities in the priority agenda. So the first one of those states, improve understanding of carbon storage and cycling in coastal ecosystems. And the way this is working out is that NOAA is helping to lead a baseline assessment, and we're partnering with Restore America's Estuaries on this. The idea is to collect the data to do, at a minimum, a Tier 1 assessment of coastal wetlands to be able to include coastal wetlands in our national greenhouse gas inventory. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when I talk about the IPCC wetland supplement. So I'll come back to that and discuss a little bit more about what does Tier 1 mean. The second activity is to determine the value of protecting coastal habitats to safeguard carbon services. And the main activity that's under that is actually partnering again with Ray on a Tampa Bay landscape assessment project, which I'll mention again in just a second. So this is a huge win. This is an emerging policy that now explicitly calls out coastal wetlands and blue carbon as important priorities for climate resilience for our country. Okay. So what about other opportunities that are policy related but not necessarily federal specific policies? So we all know in this country we do not have a national compliance market for greenhouse gases. Maybe we'll get there eventually, but we're definitely not there now. So NOAA has been partnering with Restore America's Estuaries to identify opportunities in the voluntary carbon market, because that's where we actually do have some traction right now. And so through that partnership, we have helped to develop a verified carbon standard, or VCS methodology, to make restoration projects eligible for carbon credits. The hope is that this will be approved by about mid-2015, so this year. It's going through its second independent review right now. We also have worked on landscape assessments. So I mentioned the Tampa Bay one. The first landscape assessment, and you may have heard a little bit about this yesterday, was the Snohomish Estuary assessment, where they found impressive numbers if you do full watershed restoration, where 8.4 million tons of CO2 could be sequestered throughout the rest of the 21st century. So this was really the first study to demonstrate that landscape restoration can have major climate mitigation benefits. And this was really a useful study for starting to discuss this more within the federal family. It made that more concrete, that we could do coastal restoration and have it have a lot more benefits than just helping to support fisheries, which is also important. And then so it's very exciting that they're doing the Tampa Bay Estuary assessment. This actually has all three of our coastal blue carbon ecosystems, salt marsh mangroves, and seagrasses, and the completion of that will hopefully be in fall of 2015. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about international policy opportunities where the U.S. is having a role here. So the Commission on Environmental Cooperation is an organization I had never heard of until about 2 years ago. How many of you have heard of the CEC? Oh, that's pretty good. Okay. So the CEC is a partnership with Canada and Mexico, and the CEC was created by a parallel bill when the U.S. signed the North American Free Trade Agreement. When we signed that, at the same time, all three countries also signed a bill that basically created this commission that said, we're going to work on environmental issues together. So we actually, a couple years ago, I was approached relatively last minute saying, we want to do a blue carbon grant, and you have about 7 days to write it. So we got that through, and we had our first grant in 2013 to 2015 with a huge role on building that community of practice. The U.S. is actually quite a bit farther ahead in terms of thinking about coastal blue carbon than the governments of Canada and Mexico. So a lot of that has been just trying to bring people up to speed, get people interested and excited about the opportunities for coastal conservation that can be related to coastal blue carbon. Very excitingly, we have a second grant starting in July of 2015. The focus of that grant is threefold. First, there's a seagrass mapping and carbon measurement in seagrasses focus, and there may actually be the potential for funding opportunities here. We're not totally sure how we're going to put this money out yet. So I mention that because you should keep your eye out if you're interested in doing seagrass mapping and carbon measurement. There may be some opportunities there for funding. We also have a focus on trying to better identify policy opportunities in all three countries. Ideally, what would happen here is that the analyses we've done of U.S. existing policies could be repeated in Canada and Mexico to look for those opportunities where we can leverage existing policies because getting new environmental legislation can be very challenging. And finally, we're also going to help support the development of a VCS methodology for conservation of coastal wetlands. So the one that's currently going through review is for restoring wetlands. We don't currently have one for if you protect a wetland that's threatened by a particular activity. And this is particularly of interest in a lot of countries around the world, including Mexico, where some of their ecosystems are highly threatened by development. And so having a methodology where you could get carbon credits for being able to demonstrate that you were going to protect a wetland that otherwise would be destroyed is very useful. All right. So I mentioned that we're trying to get coastal greenhouse gases from wetlands, either sequestration and storage or emissions, included in our national greenhouse gas inventory. That is coming from the fact that in 2013, the IPCC basically released a wetland supplement. So previous greenhouse guidance from 2006 did not include wetlands, and this was largely because the IPCC felt as if, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, did not think that there was enough data to include wetlands yet. But by 2013, it was clear that there was more data available, and so the 2013 Wetland Supplement provides parties with guidance on how to include the emissions from wetlands in their inventories. Now, I want to make it clear, this is not a requirement yet. Countries do not have to include wetlands. Parties are encouraged to try incorporating wetlands and to gain experience in implementing the guidelines and then report back to the IPCC by 2017. But this is a huge opportunity for countries to step up who care about their wetlands emissions and sequestration and storage. And so the U.S. is working hard to include coastal wetlands in our national greenhouse gas inventory by fall of 2016. And so this is the baseline assessment effort I mentioned. This baseline assessment effort will feed directly into trying to incorporate our coastal wetlands into our greenhouse gas inventory. Hopefully being one of the first countries to do that, to demonstrate that it is possible and this is how you can do it. Now I mentioned before we're gonna aim for at least a Tier 1 assessment. There's 3 different levels you can do this at. At Tier 1 you use global default values for emissions coming out of impacted wetlands. In a Tier 2 assessment, you use regionally or country-specific data for what your emissions might be. And then at a Tier 3 level, which is actually what the U.S. does for our forested ecosystems, you're measuring and modeling all of your carbon inputs and outputs. It's going to take a while before we could consider getting to a Tier 3 level in the U.S., but we definitely hope to get to at least the Tier 1 and maybe the Tier 2 by the time we're submitting our coastal wetlands in our national greenhouse gas inventory. Okay, I know this crowd probably is less interested in international policy, but with the next COP in Paris in December coming up this year, I had to mention this briefly. So there have been some investigations about where can coastal blue carbon fit into current United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, mechanisms. And there's really three decent opportunities here. One of them is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, or REDD+. Another is the Clean Development Mechanism. And the third is nationally appropriate mitigation actions. So REDD+ provides financial incentives to protect forest carbon reserves in developing countries, so avoided emissions. And the CDM develops projects to reduce emissions that then countries can sell those credits, so they can sell those emission credits. Now, interestingly, mangroves can already be included in both of these. Seagrasses and salt marshes, really, there is no place to play here because they're not forests. And both soil and biomass carbon can be included. So this is great for coastal blue carbon. The challenge is that each country defines for itself what constitutes a forest, and some countries have actually defined forests either based on height or by diameter or breast height, and mangroves don't fit. They're too small and they don't fit. And so some countries actually that have major mangrove resources have defined themselves out. So there needs to be some education here that there are opportunities if they could modify their definition so that mangroves could be included. Now this isn't exclusive for all countries. Some countries do include mangroves. So that's an exciting opportunity. The one I actually get most excited about, but there's not a lot happening here yet, are these NAMAs, this NAMA mechanism to assist developing countries in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason I get excited here is that countries define what mitigation actions they choose to include. And there's lots of flexibility with how these are funded. They can be funded through private or government funding. So there's a lot more flexibility here, which means all three blue carbon ecosystems could be included in these NAMA options. Now, that said, nobody quite knows how these negotiations in December are going to go and how much of the Kyoto Protocol that was established is going to stay the same in this new negotiated agreement and how much is going to change. So we don't really know whether these same types of frameworks will move forward. That said, there's been a lot invested in these, so I hope we don't lose them completely. And we could base anything moving forward on opportunities that have already been identified here with the hope that coastal blue carbon ecosystems can be even more included in future international climate mitigation opportunities. All right. I was asked to try to talk not just at the national level, but you all have to realize I basically work at the national level. But a regional example I'm familiar with is what's going on in California. So I wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what's happening there because I think this is super exciting. In 2006, California signed the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that basically committed California to reaching 1990 emissions levels by 2020. This is a very impressive goal. So they're using a variety of approaches to get there, and this includes policies, regulation, and market approaches. So it's important to note they're not just using cap and trade to get there. They're using a lot of different mechanisms. So it's multiple slices of that pie to get there. So in terms of the cap and trade program, this began in 2012 in California, and you can offset 8% of compliance requirements using offsets if you're one of those industries that needs to do compliance and do offsets. So 8% can be done using offsets. Now, current offsets that are included include forestry, dairy digesters, and destruction of ozone-depleting substances. So the proceeds from the cap and trade program are going to this greenhouse gas reduction fund. And note that right now, wetland restoration is not an option here. However, what California has done is that they have committed to fund $50 million for wetland restoration projects. In fact, 12 projects were just announced with $21 million going to these wetland restoration projects. And this included 2 salt marsh projects, including Elkhorn Slough, which you see pictured here. So this is really exciting because even though they're not allowing at the moment wetlands to be a specific offset where you could buy a specific amount of credits by doing wetland restoration, they're turning around and using their funds that are generated through this market to support wetland restoration because they recognize that this could be a really important way to be getting obviously co-benefits from wetlands, but the climate mitigation benefits of wetlands. So in my opinion, this is a huge, awesome pilot to see how effective can we actually be when we fund these projects at a large scale in terms of wetlands and climate mitigation opportunities. And folks who live in California, hope I covered that well enough, but okay, good. But there's folks here who might know more than I do. All right. So I also in my talk mentioned that there are opportunities for coastal blue carbon that may not say climate mitigation specifically, right? And I really see a lot of that happening in the coastal resilience world right now. So post-Sandy, there's been huge growing interest. I just have not seen interest like this in the role of natural and green infrastructure to improve coastal resilience. That has just been a huge trend in the US and in the federal family. So basically the idea is we can use ecosystems or combinations of green and then gray or built approaches, and this is termed hybrid approaches, for storm and erosion protection. And so here we're talking about lots of ecosystems, but including our coastal blue carbon ecosystem. So marshes and mangroves, but also reefs, beaches, dunes, barrier islands. The state of our knowledge on green infrastructure, there have been some publications on this, but really not a big synthesis until recently on what really is the state of our knowledge. And so basically what we're finding is that the area of natural ecosystem is one factor that influences how much storm and erosion protection you get. So the bigger the area, the more storm protection you're likely to get, and that makes a lot of sense. However, even narrow bands of wetlands or coral reefs can significantly reduce wave heights. And it's really important to be giving that message so that people understand that these green infrastructure opportunities really are valuable for storm and erosion protection. So the benefits of using a more natural approach include that natural systems can strengthen with time, they can be self-maintaining, they have the potential to self-repair after storms. In some cases, they can keep up with sea level rise, like Megan was just saying, right? Marshes can keep growing if they're healthy and not stressed by other human stressors. A seawall, once you build it, that's its height. It's not going to grow with sea level rise. So then what height do you build it to? With these natural systems, they tend to actually adapt and grow with sea level rise. They can be more cost effective, and I think it's really great because they provide all sorts of benefits all the time, whereas gray infrastructure only provides you the storm protection benefit when the storm is approaching. The rest of the time, they're actually having a detrimental effect oftentimes on our coastal ecosystems. So I actually just had a publication come out a couple weeks ago on this, and again, email me if you're interested. For those for whom the hybrid approach is maybe a slightly newer concept, there is no one definition of what makes a hybrid approach. Some of you have probably heard of living shorelines. That's a hybrid approach where there's a built feature oftentimes combined with a more natural feature. Other ways of doing a hybrid approach might be a community might decide they were going to restore a salt marsh in front of them, or maybe even an oyster reef and a salt marsh. But then in addition, for that extra protection when a storm is approaching, they might choose to have an operable floodgate that would close as a storm approached, right? So there's your combination of some green, but some extra gray for those big events. All right, so just to show you that this really is real, and it really is happening. This is a picture that came out right after Sandy, and it was from an article entitled "Protecting the City Before Next Time" in the New York Times on November 3rd, 2012. And here's the city, and somebody made this great fanciful picture of all sorts of restored oyster reefs and marshy wetlands that would just be throughout the harbor in New York. I think that would be awesome. They're not actually doing that, but they're doing something that is also a hybrid approach. This is called the Big U Project, and it's for downtown New York, and it was one winner of the Rebuild by Design contest that New York City ran. And so the Big U is because you can see kind of a greenish yellow line that runs this way and around, okay? So the built part is really this line on this side and this side, where they're going to put up big flood walls that, that will help to provide flood protection. This part down here then is going to be this natural area. It's not wetlands, but it's natural area, and it will serve as an amazing recreational opportunity and outdoor space. And then if a storm comes through, it's totally okay if that whole area floods. So this really is an example of the hybrid approach being implemented. And so I want all of you to think about coastal blue carbon habitats are a lot more than carbon sinks. And so there's really an opportunity to capitalize on this interest in green and hybrid approaches to promote coastal restoration in general, which then also likely would have some carbon benefits as well. Okay, so really fast, in order to support all these policy opportunities I've been talking about though, we have some specific science needs, things like better regionally specific estimates of carbon sequestration and storage, as well as emissions. We need a much better understanding of our seagrass extent and condition, and to some degree our salt marshes as well. We need to better understand the emissions from degraded coastal ecosystems. This helps us figure out how to calculate things like offset ratios, mitigation ratios when we lose these ecosystems. We need to better understand the fate of carbon in ecosystems where there are changes happening, such as shifting ecosystems where mangroves are moving into salt marsh. We need to understand when we restore a system, how quickly do we get back these carbon services that we care about? And how much coastal restoration is possible in the US? Where are those really great opportunities, and how much could we really do? This is something that, a high-level policy question that keeps coming up and that we actually don't have a good answer to. So, looking ahead, I think we have made amazing progress in the last 5 years. It's incredibly exciting that we're having this kind of a workshop and that we can demonstrate the kind of progress that has already occurred. And so I really see that there's a huge positive outlook for the next 5 to 10 years if we all are going to move forward on these science and policy opportunities. And I just wanted to mention, just yesterday, Sri Lanka announced that they want to be the first nation to protect all of their remaining mangroves. I think this kind of statement is only happening because of the kinds of discussions and the kind of political pressure and acknowledgement that's happening because of all the efforts that many of you in this room have been working on. So this is really exciting. We're at a really great time to be working on coastal blue carbon. And I'm happy to take questions. Hopefully I didn't run too long over time. Thank you.
So I have a question. As a policy advisor to NOAA, how would you justify the mixing of proactive restoration center funds with even a voluntary offset market-driven monies from carbon? So how would you justify projects that are done just essentially because of the net benefit, the net gain, and then mixing those proactive dollars with some sort of offset carbon market, even if it's voluntary, not even if it's part of a sort of a cap and trade system, but if it's just a voluntary?
Okay, so let me see if I'm understanding the question. And I may not have made it clear. If you have to do mitigation for something, then voluntary carbon market credits will not happen.
Yeah, I'm not talking about mitigation. So and how do you carve off? You're looking at these projects that may have some component, but it's very difficult to segregate which part is going to be for the carbon, voluntary offset, and which will be a proactive habitat restoration effort. So I guess my question is, how would you kind of justify, from a policy standpoint, the intermingling of proactive restoration funds with voluntary offset funds for coastal restoration? Because a lot of these projects need multiple funding sources for them to survive. There's not one single source. Even the Restoration Center does not fund projects soup to nuts, start to end. And so there's a need for flexibility, but we're kind of straining with that, the conflict of interests in terms of using basically offsets, even if they're voluntary, in a proactive habitat restoration environment.
Well, so Steve Emma-Maddox might actually be able to comment on this too, but the way the VCS methodology is being designed, Restore America's Estuaries actually went through the process for the US of determining what could be considered additional. So what's really important with the voluntary carbon market is that it never supports something that would have happened already, right? Because then you don't get the additional environmental benefit that you're paying for. That's the whole point of it being voluntary. It's not a compliance-driven thing. It's not something you had to do because you impacted a wetland somewhere, right? So it has to be additional. And part of submitting that VCS methodology for review was to do a study of additionality to say, basically, there's so little restoration happening in the US at the moment, and this was US specific, that pretty much any project that's being done could be considered additional. So that's going through review right now, has not been fully approved yet, but if it gets approved, that would suggest that any project that was not done for mitigation purposes could be considered additional. So what that means is you could get money from NOAA's Restoration Center to do a project. It's okay if it's federally financed, and you could still ask for voluntary carbon market credits for that whole project. Did I get that right, Steve? Okay. So that's really exciting. If we can get that additionality piece approved, there wouldn't be the need to say, well, I can only use this part of this project for carbon credits. You could actually take the whole project and say, I'm putting this forward for carbon credits. Now, that will only be for the US, and the hope is that there might be the opportunity to actually do this at a global scale, but that would be a separate analysis that would have to then be approved separately. But it's really exciting if we can get that piece approved for the US, because then you won't have that perceived conflict of interest that you were talking about.
So you talk about, this is exciting, the national baseline assessment for coastal wetlands, blue carbon. And you also said that they're highly variable. The national greenhouse gas inventory reporting is done every year. How can you continue with that sort of assessment year by year? What would it require to measure the changes on a yearly basis,
Yeah.
not just a one time.
Yeah. So the way this works for the wetlands would be that every year we'd have to assess what acreage was changing, and that's both what's becoming wetlands through restoration, for example, and then also what are we losing in terms of how many acres of wetlands are being converted to specific activities. And the way it's set up right now is that you have to know what activity it's being converted to. Is it being converted to agriculture? Is it being converted to aquaculture? Is it being developed into a hotel? So you have these categories of activities, and then you take that acreage that was converted or restored, right? There's the restored piece too, and then out of that you get either an emissions factor or a sequestration factor. And that tier 1 that I was mentioning, then all you do is use those global numbers that came out in the IPCC guidance saying, well, if it's agriculture, it's this default emission factor. So what we'd have to do to track it every year is be looking at what changed in terms of our area, and then if we were just using the tier 1 assessment, that's all we'd have to be tracking differently every year, and then you just apply the math each year. If we wanted to do the tier 2, then we'd be wanting those regional estimates, and we would actually want to make sure that as more data were coming out, we were informing those regional estimates and making them better every year. But again, the hardest math is probably the tracking of that change in land use, and that's what we have to do every year, and just make that a part of the routine evaluation of what's going on in our coasts. Yep.
Thank you for your presentation. So I have a question that, as you stated in your talk, that what other countries are dealing with is that existing land is not counted in any way, shape, or form in terms of giving some sort of monetary credits, and that there's a need to kind of acknowledge to protect what we already have. And so here in the U.S., we have states and communities that have gone out in front and set aside lands, as you know, that are protected. And the challenge that we face is managing those protected areas in the face of all the people that want to be there. And the resources for that is so limited that I see just an acknowledgement and value in what we have as being critical. And so I'm wondering, if you use a crystal ball and you look ahead 5 years or 10 years, do you see a universe where, as a national policy, or just as even within Massachusetts or individual communities, where we're actually valuing what we have and putting resources into that so that existing lands can do more with, as we heard of the MPS example of, you know, trying to do restoration on the land they already own? I'm wondering how we start that dialogue, because we're so challenged to actually steward what we've got, and let alone keep moving forward. So I'm excited at that potential of public awareness, but asking you to do that. What do you think 5 years from now? Right. So again, that kind of relates to the first question, where, you know, in terms of if we were going to, let's say we have a protected area, but it needs some restoration. We already know it's been degraded to some degree, and we want to try and bring it back to a healthier state. If the VCS methodology with the additionality piece is approved, then it would be okay for a state agency or a federal agency to say, we're going to do this restoration, and then we're going to apply for carbon credits to help offset some of that cost. It's clearly never going to cover the full cost of restoration, likely, at least not with anywhere near the carbon market prices we have right now. But it would help to offset that, and maybe it would help to meet some of those matching fund requirements or things like that that are sometimes in place, right? The other thing is, if we can get this VCS methodology for conservation in place. I was actually talking to one of the people in the Marine Protected Areas part of NOAA recently, and she was saying it would be so neat if this gave an additional incentive for us to try and tackle some of the challenges that we know are degrading some of our MPA areas. If we could then find that there was a way to tackle some of those challenges and apply for carbon credits, that might be an additional incentive to really do some of the stuff we know we have to do, but there's so many things we know we have to do, we can't get to them all. So it might start to shift the conversation and provide some opportunities for at least some funding to help offset some of the costs of doing these types of management, things that we know we should be doing, but people don't have the funds to do. I don't immediately see that suddenly there's just going to be gobs and gobs of money,
But I think we also haven't really had a good pilot to test how interested is the voluntary carbon market in wetlands credits, right? Suddenly, you could be choosing to be a sustainable corporation or an individual interested in offsetting your individual carbon footprint, and instead of needing to send that money to the tropical forest somewhere, which is great, you could say, yeah, but I'm going to do it in my own backyard. You know, I live in Louisiana, I live in North Carolina, I live in Maryland, I live in Massachusetts. I want that money to go here to do coastal conservation, but still get my climate mitigation benefits. How exciting. I think we don't know what the power of that market is yet. It may not be what I hope it is, but we really haven't tested it yet. And I'm hopeful that people are going to turn around and say, yeah, I go to the coast in the summer. I want to protect the areas I love. That's where I'm going to put my money, either companies or individuals. Yeah. Thank you.